Leo Moore, a quiet janitor and retired Army officer, secretly feeds Sam, a hungry 11-year-old at Willow Creek Elementary. Their unspoken bond grows through sandwiches and notes until Principal Simmons fires Leo for breaking food policies. Sam's letter to his uncle, Major Scott, sparks a movement. Marines, veterans, and families converge in a convoy to honor Leo, revealing his heroic past. The school reverses his termination, creating a new role for him. Leo's small act of kindness transforms the community, igniting a national conversation about compassion. But what drove Leo to risk everything for Sam? If Leo's story inspired you, join us in celebrating everyday heroes. Share your own kindness stories in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe for more uplifting tales. Spread this video to inspire others. Let's build stronger communities together. Thank you for supporting our channel. The principal's voice sliced through the autumn air, sharp and unyielding, echoing across the playground like a whip crack. This is a school, not a charity. Who gave you permission to feed him? Leonard Leo Moore, the soft-spoken janitor known to all as Leo, stood frozen by the weathered wooden bench, his calloused hands cradling a simple brown paper bag. The weight of the accusation hung heavy in the crisp breeze, and Leo's heart sank, not from shame but from the sting of misunderstanding. He didn't utter a word in his defense. His gray eyes, etched with lines from years of silent burdens, dropped to the ground as two security guards flanked him, their steps heavy with authority. The children scattered across the playground, mid-game and mid-laughter, fell silent. Their young faces, usually bright with the carefree joy of recess, now twisted in confusion and quiet sorrow as they watched the man they adored being led away. Leo's worn work boots scuffed the asphalt, each step a quiet protest against the injustice, though he'd never voice it. By that afternoon, the bench where he'd stood abandoned, its chipped green paint a mute witness to the kindness it had once held. The playground felt colder, emptier, as if Leo's absence had drained a bit of its soul. Come Monday, the school parking lot told a different story. Gone were the usual minivans and hurried parents. In their place stood a row of sleek black military SUVs, their polished surfaces glinting under the morning sun. From them emerged Marines in pristine dress uniforms, their medals catching the light like small constellations pinned to their chests. The sight sent a ripple of whispers through the gathered crowd of teachers and students. Who were these soldiers here for? Why had an entire platoon assembled, their faces solemn yet proud, ready to salute a man the school had so callously discarded? Leonard Leo Moore, at 69, was the kind of man most people passed by without a second glance, and that suited him just fine. But beneath his unassuming exterior lay a life rich with courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to those who needed him most. Leo had never sought the spotlight. A retired Army logistics officer, he carried the weight of his past like a shadow he had learned to live with. His years in service had been marked by chaos, sandstorms that blinded the senses, gunfire that drowned out thought, and the relentless task of keeping supplies moving to soldiers who depended on him. He'd seen young men and women return home scarred, their bodies or minds bearing wounds no metal could erase. Worse still, he'd seen caskets draped in flags, each one a wound to his soul. When Leo left the military, he didn't hunger for recognition or fanfare. He yearned for quiet, for a life where he could mend rather than break, nurture rather than lose. That peace came unexpectedly in the form of a janitor's job at Willow Creek Elementary. For 7 years, Leo had been the school's silent guardian, sweeping dusty hallways, repairing wobbly desks, tightening leaky faucets, and scrubbing away the sticky fingerprints that adorned the walls like a child's signature. To the staff, he was reliable, a steady cog in the school's machinery. To the parents, he was all but invisible, just another face in the background of their busy lives. But to the children, Leo was something else entirely, a quiet hero, a gentle giant they called Uncle Leo. The kids saw what adults often missed. They noticed the peppermints he kept tucked in his pocket, ready to offer to anyone nursing a bad day or a bruised heart. They knew he'd kneel to tie a loose shoelace, search tirelessly for a lost mitten, or carefully tape together a beloved picture book that had begun to unravel. Leo didn't just keep the school clean, he kept its spirit alight. his small acts of care weaving a warmth that lingered long after the final bell. At home, his Army medals, earned through sweat, blood, and unspoken bravery, sat hidden in a drawer, gathering dust. His walls bore no photographs, no mementos of his past. He owned no veteran's cap, no badge to proclaim his service. Leo didn't need to remind anyone of who he'd been. His mission now was simpler, purer. Keep the school running, be a steady anchor for the children who needed one. And he had a particular tenderness for the kids who slipped through the cracks, the ones in threadbare shoes, the ones who lingered too long after school, waiting for a parent who was late or never came. He saw the ones who watched their classmates unpack colorful lunches while their own lunchboxes sat empty. Leo knew hunger, not just for food, but for kindness, for someone to see you when the world seemed to look away. That understanding drove him, rooted deep in his bones, and it's why 11-year-old Sam Turner caught his eye. Sam was a wisp of a boy, slight and wiry, with deep brown eyes that held a quiet intensity. Those eyes saw everything, the laughter of other kids, the casual ease of their friendships, the small joys they took for granted, but revealed little of his own heart. To most, Sam was just shy, a kid who faded into the background. But to those who looked closer, there was a weight in his silence, a watchfulness born of carrying burdens too heavy for his young shoulders. 2 years ago, Sam's world had shattered. His father, Staff Sergeant Mark Turner, had died in Afghanistan, shielding his unit from an ambush. The folded flag presented to Sam and his mother, Emily, now rested on a shelf in his bedroom, a constant reminder of a loss too vast for words. Emily, left to raise Sam alone, worked tirelessly. Night shifts as a nurse, day shifts as a grocery clerk. Her exhaustion was palpable. Her love for Sam fierce, but stretched thin. Sometimes in the blur of her double shifts, things slipped, like packed lunches, or the time to notice how quiet her son had become. One chilly October morning, Leo spotted Sam sitting alone on the playground's edge during lunch. The boy's thin jacket did little against the biting wind, and his hands were empty, no lunchbox in sight. Something in Sam's posture, the way his shoulders hunched, the way his eyes followed the other kids with a mix of longing and resignation, tugged at Leo's heart. He remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, to crave not just food but the dignity of being seen. Without a word, Leo approached, his steps soft on the grass. He set the brown paper bag beside Sam, murmuring, "Thought you might be hungry." Inside was a simple sandwich, an apple, and a few cookies. Nothing grand, but enough to fill the ache. Sam looked up, startled, his eyes searching Leo's face for judgment or pity. Finding neither, he accepted the bag with a whispered thank you, his fingers clutching it like a lifeline. From that day on, Leo made it his quiet mission to check on Sam, slipping him a lunch when needed, offering a smile or a story to ease the boy's solitude. To Leo, it wasn't charity, it was duty, the kind that had defined his life. To Soheim, it was a spark of hope, a reminder that he wasn't always have to face the world alone. Sam sat alone on the splintered bench at the playground's edge. His faded backpack slumped beside him like a weary companion. A small plastic cup of water rested in his hands, its surface trembling with each breeze. Around him, the playground pulsed with life. Children sprawled on the grass, tearing into peanut butter sandwiches, pizza slices, oozing cheese, and juice boxes drained with noisy slurps. Their laughter ricocheted across the open space, a vibrant chorus of belonging that Sam watched from afar, his body curled inward, as if shrinking might make the ache of exclusion less sharp. Joining them felt impossible, like stepping into a story where he didn't know the lines. Leo, the janitor, ambled past, his mop handle slung over his shoulder like a rifle from his army days. The soft clink of peppermints in his pocket, a familiar rhythm. His boots scuffed the pavement as he slowed, his gaze settling on the boy's quiet isolation. Crouching slightly, he moved with the care of someone approaching a skittish creature. "Everything all right, buddy?" he asked, his voice a low, steady warmth, rough around the edges, but kind. Sam's shoulders twitched in a half-hearted shrug, his eyes locked on the cracked pavement. "Yeah," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "Just not hungry." The lie was brittle, and Leo saw through it instantly. The tight jaw, the downcast eyes, the pride masking a deeper need. He'd seen that look before in soldiers too stubborn to admit they were breaking, in children fighting to hold on to dignity in places where survival was a daily battle. It stirred something heavy in him, but he didn't pry. With a quiet nod, he stood, adjusted his mop, and walked away, the boy's silence trailing him like a shadow. That night, in the soft hum of his small kitchen, the refrigerator's drone the only sound, Leo stood at the counter, his thoughts heavy with Sam's hollow gaze. He reached for a loaf of bread, spreading peanut butter and jelly with care, making an extra sandwich. He wrapped it in foil, added a crisp apple and a carton of milk, and set it aside. It was modest, but it was something, a quiet gesture to tell a boy he wasn't forgotten. From that gesture, a silent ritual took root. Each morning before the school bell rang, Leo would place a brown paper bag on the bench where Sam always sat. Inside was a simple meal, turkey or peanut butter, a banana or apple, a juice box. He never lingered, never pointed it out. He'd set the bag down, shift his shoulder, and carry on, blending into the school's rhythm. Sam, too, kept the secret, never acknowledging the bag's arrival. But he'd take it, eat quietly, and let the nourishment work its way into his soul. Over time, his shoulders began to lift, and the shadows under his eyes faded, his steps less weighed down by the world's cruelty. One afternoon, as Leo swept the hallway, his broom whispering against the tiles, he glanced out at the playground. Sam wasn't on the bench, but was out on the field, kicking a soccer ball with two boys, his laughter ringing clear and bright. Leo paused, a soft smile breaking across his face, before turning back to his work, the sound of that joy settling warmly in his chest. As the days passed, Leo began adding notes to the bags, scribbled lines on scraps of paper. A fact: camels can drink 30 gallons in one go. An encouragement: be brave today, Sam, you're tougher than you think. Sometimes a doodle, a tank with shades, a goofy son with stick arms. For Leo, these were small acts, but for Shepon, they were everything, a tether to someone who cared. Lunchtime became a quiet ritual, a moment where of the world's kindness reached him. Their bond grew, unspoken but unbreakable, woven from sandwiches and juice boxes. Leo never sought thanks, understanding that true kindness asks for nothing. For Sam, those bags were a lifeline, proof he wasn't invisible. But kindness cast ripples, and Principal Carol Simmons, with her crisp suits and clipboard, noticed the bag on the bench, her sharp eyes catching a crack in her ordered world. The playground buzzed with the carefree chaos of children, their laughter weaving through the warm Friday afternoon air. Sam Turner, a wiry boy with tousled hair and eyes that held a quiet resilience, sat alone on his usual bench, his stomach rumbling softly. The brown paper bag appeared as it often did, placed gently by Leo, the school janitor, whose broad shoulders and steady gait were as familiar to the students as the creaky swings. Leo didn't linger. He never did. His act of kindness was a silent ritual, born from a heart that saw what others missed. As he turned away, his mop handle resting against his shoulder like a trusted companion, he felt a flicker of warmth, knowing Sam wouldn't go hungry today. But fate, sharp and unyielding, had other plans. Carol Simmons, the principal, strode across the playground, her heels striking the pavement with the precision of a metronome. Rules were her anchor, the framework that kept Willow Creek Elementary from descending into disorder. To her, they were non-negotiable, the threads that stitched together the fabric of a functioning school. Her eyes, ever vigilant, caught Sam tearing into the sandwich, a handwritten note fluttering onto his lap. The sight stopped her cold, her lips pressed into a thin line as she approached, her voice slicing through the playground's hum. "Sam, where did this come from? Who gave you that food?" Sam froze, the sandwich halfway to his mouth, his wide eyes darting like a cornered animal. The playground seemed to hold its breath, the other children pausing mid-game, sensing the shift in the air. Across the yard, Leo's heart sank as he saw the scene unfold. Without a second thought, he walked toward them, his mop handle now a steadying prop, its weight grounding him as he faced the storm. "It was me, ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the calm of someone who'd weathered far worse than a principal's scrutiny. Carol's gaze snapped to him, her face tightening with disapproval. Did you have authorization, Leo? Do you understand this violates health regulations? School policy explicitly forbids distributing outside food. What if Sam has allergies? What if his parents decide to sue? Her words came fast, each one a hammer striking the rules she held sacred. Leo stood still, absorbing her lecture. He heard her, understood the logic of her world, a world of forms, permissions, and liability. But in his mind, another truth burned brighter, one forged in the crucible of battlefields and hard-won lessons. Sometimes a hungry child mattered more than a rulebook. He didn't argue, he simply nodded, his silence a quiet rebellion against her rigid framework. Within the hour, the machinery of bureaucracy churned with ruthless efficiency. Leo was summoned to the office, where a stern-faced Carol handed him termination papers. There was no discussion, no chance to explain, no mercy. "Rules are rules," she said. Her voice clipped, as if that settled everything. Leo accepted the papers without protest, his weathered hands steady as he folded them. In the small custodian's closet, his sanctuary for 7 years, he moved with deliberate care, gathering his few belongings. He folded his uniform with the precision of a soldier, tucking it into a worn duffel bag alongside a battered thermos and a framed photo of his late wife. Each motion was heavy with the weight of leaving behind a place that had become his purpose, a place where he'd found meaning in small acts of care. Outside, the children pressed their faces against the classroom windows, their breath fogging the glass. They watched in stunned silence as Leo, the man who'd patched their broken desks, found their lost soccer balls, and offered gentle smiles when they cried, made his way to the front doors. Their hearts ached with a confusion they couldn't name, a sense of loss too big for their young minds to grasp. Leo paused at the threshold, turning back one last time. His eyes swept over the school, lingering on the faces at the windows. He raised a hand in a small wave, his expression soft but tinged with a quiet sorrow. Then, with the same straight-back dignity he'd carried through years of military service, he stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a final, hollow thud. That weekend, while Willow Creek settled into its sleepy routines, Sam sat at the worn kitchen table in his cramped apartment. The single bulb overhead cast a dim, flickering light, humming faintly as it struggled to illuminate the room. His mother slept in the next room, her breathing heavy with the exhaustion of an overnight shift at the hospital. The fridge in the corner rattled, its shelves holding little more than a carton of milk and a half-empty jar of mustard. Sam's small hand gripped a pencil, his knuckles pale as he poured his thoughts onto a lined sheet of paper. His handwriting was slow, each letter formed with care, as if the words themselves could carry the weight of his heart. He wrote to his Uncle Dan, a major at Camp Lejeune, his words spilling out in a rush of guilt and grief. He described Leo's kindness, the sandwiches that had filled his empty stomach, the warmth of a note that made him feel seen. He confessed how Leo had been fired because of him, how the janitor's quiet generosity had been the one bright spot in a school that often felt cold and indifferent. Sam's chest tightened as he wrote about his mother's endless work, the hunger that gnawed at him when she wasn't home, the ache of missing his father who'd never come back from overseas. He paused, his pencil hovering, then added a final line, and vulnerable. "I miss Dad." Folding the letter with the precision his father had taught him, Sam sealed it in an envelope, pressing it shut with a determined thumb. He used the last of his allowance to affix a stamp, his fingers trembling slightly as he smoothed it into place. Early Monday morning, before the world stirred, he walked alone to the mailboxes at the corner, his sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk. He slipped the letter inside, the metal slot clanging shut with a sound that felt final, like a promise sent into the unknown. Days later at Camp Lejeune, Major Daniel Scott sat in his office, sorting through a stack of mail, memos, reports, and supply orders, all part of the relentless rhythm of military life. His calloused fingers paused when they landed on an envelope bearing Sam's familiar, childish scrawl. A pang of tenderness cut through his usual focus as he opened it carefully, unfolding the letter with the reverence of a man who knew how fragile a child's trust could be. As he read, the sounds of the pie, the cadence of marching boots, the rumble of vehicles, the sharp commands of drills, faded into nothing. Sam's words painted a vivid picture, a boy grappling with loss, a mother stretched thin, a school that had punished kindness. Daniel's jaw tightened, his heart heavy with the weight of his nephew's pain. Sam had never written to complain, not once since his father's death. Not about the loneliness, not about the hunger, not about the void left by a hero who'd never come home. But this letter was different, raw and urgent, a cry for someone to see what he couldn't fix alone. Daniel folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pocket. As he stared out the window, the distant horizon blurring, he felt a resolve stirring within him, a promise to act, to be the anchor Sam needed in a world that felt adrift. At the heart of Major Daniel Scott's thoughts was not the sparse contents of a refrigerator or the quiet, lonely nights his nephew endured, but this single piercing moment that had shattered the boy's resilient silence. As he leaned back in his office chair, the weight of the revelation pressed against his chest, heavy and unyielding. His mind churned, pulling him back through the years to a name that still carried a quiet reverence in the halls of his memory. Leo Moore. To most, Leo was just a janitor, a man who swept floors and emptied trash cans at Willow Creek Elementary. But to Scott, he was something far greater, a former logistics officer whose meticulous care had ensured that fallen soldiers returned home with the dignity they deserved. Scott could still picture him, working through the night, his hands steady as he pressed crisp uniforms, folded flags with precision, polished boots until they gleamed, and penned heartfelt notes to families drowning in grief. Leo was the invisible force, the man nobody noticed but everyone relied on when the stakes were highest. And now, as Scott sat in the dim glow of his office lamp, he realized Leo hadn't changed. He was still the same steadfast guardian, this time watching over his nephew Sam with the same quiet devotion. That kind of loyalty, Scott knew, transcended rank, uniform, or any chain of command. It demanded respect, and it demanded action. By the time dawn broke over the Marine base in North Carolina, a quiet but purposeful energy pulsed through the air. Major Scott stood before 3 sleek black SUVs, his jaw tight, his eyes sweeping over the men and women assembling around him. The news had spread like a spark in dry grass, igniting something fierce and unspoken among the ranks. What had started as a personal mission, sparked by the letter from his nephew Sam, detailing Leo's firing for the simple act of feeding a hungry child, had grown into something far larger. The moment Scott shared the letter with his commanding officer, it rippled through the base, stirring hearts and consciences. Leo Moore wasn't just any janitor. He was a veteran, a man who had once borne the sacred duty of bringing fallen heroes home. And the child he'd fed? The son of a soldier who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The injustice of it burned in Scott's chest, a mix of anger and resolve that mirrored the expressions of the Marines around him. They weren't gathering for a fight or a protest. They were coming to honor a man whose service had never wavered, even after he'd hung up his uniform. As the sun rose, the 3 SUVs rolled out from Camp Lejeune, their polished surfaces catching the light. Inside, the Marines sat in full-dress uniform, their faces set with purpose. They carried no weapons, no tactical gear, only flags carefully folded, letters written with care, and medals, gleaming symbols of respect. But as the convoy crossed into Georgia, something extraordinary unfolded. The story of Leo Moore had spread beyond the base, carried by veteran networks, military family group chats, and threads on social media. It moved like wildfire, touching hearts far and wide. By the time the SUVs reached the Georgia border, their numbers had doubled. Veterans on motorcycles, their engines roaring like a chorus of resolve, joined the procession. Families in pickup trucks, some with children waving small American flags, fell in line. Active duty soldiers on leave drove for hours to be part of it. They came not to shout or demand, but to stand in quiet, unshakable solidarity. This wasn't just about Leo or Sam anymore. It was about the enduring truth that some acts of service never end, no matter how many years pass or how humble the role. Inside one of the SUVs, Major Scott's fingers brushed against the faded photograph he kept in his breast pocket. It was an old image of a younger Leo Moore, standing tall on an airfield tarmac beside a flag-draped casket. The memory hit him like a wave. sharp and vivid. He could still see Leo's quiet strength, the way he moved with purpose through the night, ensuring every detail was perfect, every uniform pressed, every medal polished, every flag folded with care. Leo had been the steady hand guiding fallen soldiers home, a man who understood that honor wasn't just in the grand gestures, but in the small, meticulous acts no one else saw. Scott's throat tightened as he glanced at the young corporal in the back seat, nervously adjusting his collar. The corporal's eyes met his and he asked, "Sir, does the school even know who they fired?" Scott's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. "No," he said softly, "but they're about to." The convoy rolled down the highway, passing sleepy towns and sprawling farms. Along the way, something remarkable happened. Word of their mission had reached local communities, and people began to gather along the roadsides. They stood in small clusters, waving flags, saluting, holding handmade signs with messages of gratitude. An elderly man in a faded veteran's cap stood alone, his hand raised in a crisp salute. A young mother held her toddler's hand, teaching him to wave at the passing vehicles. The sight stirred something deep in Scott, a mix of pride and humility. This wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about reminding everyone that loyalty and dignity endure, that the sacrifices of men like Leo Moore ripple far beyond the battlefield. By Monday morning, as the first rays of sunlight bathed Willow Creek Elementary, the school's parking lot had transformed into a scene of quiet reverence. Rows of black SUVs and motorcycles lined the front drive, their presence as commanding as any military procession. Marines stepped out in unison, their dress uniforms immaculate, their boots striking the pavement with a rhythmic thud. Medals gleamed in the early light, catching the eyes of parents who froze mid-step, their morning routines forgotten. Children, usually buzzing with chatter during drop-off, pressed their faces to car windows, their eyes wide with awe at the sight of the uniformed men and women moving with disciplined precision. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent acknowledgement that something profound was unfolding. Principal Carol stood at the school's entrance, her usual air of authority faltering as she took in the scene. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, her mind racing to comprehend the gravity of what was happening. She had known Leo Moore as the quiet janitor who kept the school spotless, the man who nodded politely but never lingered in conversation. She hadn't known his past, hadn't known the weight of his service or the depth of his character. Now, as the Marines assembled before her, their presence a testament to the man she'd so easily dismissed, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. For Major Scott, standing at the forefront of the procession, this moment was more than a confrontation. It was a reckoning. It was a chance to honor a man whose quiet heroism had never wavered, a man who had stood by his nephew when no one else had. And as the Marines moved forward, their steps steady and their purpose clear, Scott knew that this was about more than one man or one child. It was about the unspoken bonds that tie those who serve, the loyalty that endures beyond the uniform, and the truth that some acts of courage shine brightest in the quietest moments. The sharp clack of Carol Simmons' high heels echoed across the asphalt, each step betraying a tremor of unease that she couldn't quite mask. As the principal of Willow Creek Elementary, she was known for her meticulous control, her ability to navigate any crisis with a clipboard and a plan. But today, as she approached the swelling crowd in the schoolyard, her polished exterior cracked. Her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut, her mind racing to find the right words. Words that, for the first time in years, eluded her. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, a mix of dread and guilt swirling in her thoughts. She had enforced the rules, done her job, but now, faced with the sea of parents, teachers, and wide-eyed children, she felt the ground shift beneath her. What had seemed so clear in the sterile light of policy manuals now felt like a misstep she couldn't undo. Major Daniel Scott stepped forward, his dress blues pristine, each crease sharp enough to slice through the tension in the air. His presence commanded attention, not through volume or force, but through the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from his very being. In his hand, he held a letter, its edges worn soft from 2 days of being unfolded and read, then folded again. It was written by his nephew Sam, a boy whose small, earnest words had stirred something deep within the Marine. Daniel's heart tightened as he thought of Sam, his bright eyes, his quiet resilience, and the way he'd sat alone on that lunch bench, hungry, until one man noticed. Daniel's jaw clenched, not with anger but with resolve. He had seen too many battles, too many moments where rules failed to account for humanity, to let this one pass unchallenged. "Ma'am," he said to Simmons, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a man who had given orders under fire. "We understand the rules, we respect order, but some acts of honor don't need a policy manual to justify them." His words were calm, deliberate, but beneath them lay a current of conviction that made Simmons' shoulders tense. With a respectful nod, he turned to the PA system, hastily set up by a young teacher whose hands still trembled from the urgency of the moment. As Daniel's voice crackled through the speakers, it rolled across the schoolyard, into the classrooms, and seemed to settle into the very air. The murmurs of the crowd faded, replaced by a hush that felt almost sacred. "Students of Willow Creek Elementary," he began, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "My name is Major Daniel Scott, United States Marine Corps. I'm here today because 3 days ago, a man you all know, a man you called Uncle Leo, was fired. Not because he broke a law, not because he caused harm, but because he fed a hungry child. That child is my nephew, Sam Turner." His voice held steady, but his chest ached as he spoke Sam's name. He could still picture the boy's small frame, hunched over on that bench, and the way Leo had seen him, not just a student, but a person in need. Daniel's eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the parents wiping tears from their cheeks, the teachers frozen in classroom doorways, the children staring up at him with wild, unblinking eyes. He let the silence stretch, giving the truth room to breathe. "What you may not know," he continued, his voice now tinged with a quiet emotion that surprised even him, "is that Leo Moore is a veteran. Years ago, when I was a younger Marine, Leo was the man who made sure our fallen brothers and sisters came home with dignity. He worked through the night, pressing uniforms, folding flags, polishing medals until they shone. He never asked for praise. He never asked for thanks." Daniel's throat tightened as memories flooded back. Leo's steady hands, his quiet focus, the way he carried the weight of those tasks without ever letting it show. And last week, without asking anyone's permission, he showed that same care to a little boy sitting alone on a bench. The crowd was silent now, save for the soft rustle of tissues and the occasional sniffle. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of sorrow and pride. Teachers, some who had quietly disagreed with Leo's firing but lacked the courage to speak up, now felt a pang of shame. The children, too young to fully grasp the weight of the moment, still sensed its importance, their eyes fixed on the tall Marine who spoke with such quiet power. "He didn't do it for applause," Daniel said, his voice softening to a near whisper. "He did it because no one gets left behind, not in the field and not in a schoolyard." The next day, the school district reversed Leo Moore's termination, a decision that felt like a collective exhale after days of tension. But they didn't stop there. In a move that caught everyone off guard, especially Leo, they offered him a new role, one crafted to honor the quiet heroism he'd shown. No longer just a janitor, Leo was named Willow Creek's first ever community outreach coordinator. The title came with a purpose: to build programs for struggling families, to support children in need, and to connect with veterans in the community. For Leo, it was more than a job. It was a recognition of the work he'd been doing all along, unnoticed, without fanfare. In his heart, he felt a quiet pride, tempered by the same humility that had always guided him. He hadn't asked for this, but he wouldn't shy away from it either. A week later, the school courtyard buzzed with anticipation. Children formed a semicircle, their faces alight with excitement, some clutching handmade signs that wobbled in their small hands. Parents stood close, their eyes bright with emotion, a few whispering words of gratitude to one another. Carol Simmons, her usual confidence softened by a newfound humility, stepped forward. The weight of her earlier decision still lingered in her mind, a quiet regret that she'd let rules blind her to what was right. Now, as she unveiled a bronze plaque near Sam's old lunch bench, she felt a flicker of redemption. The inscription was simple but profound. Here, someone did the right thing, not because they had to, but because they couldn't look away. Leo stood beside the plaque, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him, unaccustomed to the spotlight. The applause that rose from the crowd felt foreign, almost overwhelming, but for the first time he didn't shrink from it. Sam stood close, his small hand slipping into Leo's weathered one, a gesture that grounded the older man in the moment. Sam's heart swelled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but also a sense of safety, knowing someone had seen him when he felt invisible. The two of them stood together, a quiet bond forged in a moment of kindness that had changed everything. The story didn't end at Willow Creek. Local news outlets seized on it, broadcasting images of Major Scott's arrival, the heartfelt ceremony, and interviews with parents, students, and veterans who saw Leo as one of their own. The story rippled outward, first across Georgia, then the country. News anchors spoke with awe about the janitor who sparked a movement. Opinion pieces wrestled with the tension between rules and compassion, asking hard questions about what it means to do the right thing. Social media erupted with hashtags. Hashtag heroes helping, #be like Leo, each post amplifying the story's reach. Other schools began to rethink their policies, inspired by Leo's quiet act. Churches, businesses, and local governments reached out to Willow Creek, eager to learn how they could foster similar compassion in their communities. What began as one man's small, unassuming gesture grew into the Heroes Helping Heroes initiative, a movement that carried Leo's spirit forward, proving that even the smallest act of kindness could change the world. At Willow Creek Elementary, a profound change had taken root, reshaping the school's once rigid atmosphere into a haven of openness and care. The transformation was subtle at first, like the slow budding of a flower after a long winter, but its impact reverberated through every hallway, every heart. Where once the school had been governed by unyielding policies, it now welcomed families with warmth and inclusion. Principal Carol Simmons, a woman whose name had once conjured images of clipboards and stern directives, found herself evolving in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her heart, once guarded by the armor of protocol, softened as she began hosting monthly listening lunches. These gatherings, held in the school's modest cafeteria, invited parents and students to share their thoughts, their fears, their dreams. For Carol, these moments were humbling. She sat quietly, her hands folded, listening as a mother spoke of her struggles, or a shy fifth grader whispered about feeling overlooked. Each story chipped away at the wall she'd built, and she felt a quiet pride in the trust she was earning. Behind her office door, a small, handwritten sign now hung, "Come in with solutions." It was a simple gesture, but it spoke of a woman learning to lead with empathy rather than authority. The teachers, too, began to see their students through new eyes. They noticed the quiet ones, Audiawins, the kids who lingered at the edges of the playground, their gazes fixed on the ground. In staff meetings, they shared stories of small breakthroughs. A boy who smiled for the first time in weeks. A girl who raised her hand after months of silence. The school's transformation wasn't just structural, it was deeply personal, woven into the daily interactions that had once been overlooked. Every afternoon, as the final bell rang and the playground filled with the joyful chaos of children, their eyes would drift to a bench near the school's entrance. A simple plaque gleamed there, its words a quiet testament to a moment that had changed everything. For the students, it was a reminder that even the smallest act, a sandwich shared, a kind word offered, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet fathom. On Veterans Day, the school courtyard became a sacred space, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. Students, teachers, parents, and veterans gathered, their faces reflecting a shared sense of reverence. The air was thick with a rare, unspoken unity, as if the weight of the moment had drawn them closer. At the heart of the ceremony stood Leo Moore, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture steady despite the years that had etched lines into his face. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, unassuming yet dignified. Beside him stood Sam Turner, a small boy whose hands trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of a folded American flag. Together they prepared to raise it, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. As the flag began its slow ascent up the pole, a hush fell over the crowd. Parents who once hurried through morning drop-offs with barely a glance now stood still, hands pressed over their hearts. Their eyes glistened with emotions they couldn't quite name. Gratitude, pride, perhaps a flicker of guilt for the moments they'd rushed past. Teachers who had once buried themselves in lesson plans and grading now watched with misty eyes, their hearts stirred by the sight of their students standing tall. Even Principal Simmons, who had once ruled with an iron hand, stood silently at the front, her face softened by a quiet awe. For her, this moment was more than a ceremony. It was proof that a school could be more than a place of learning. It could be a place of healing. For Leo, standing beside Sam, the moment was deeply personal. He wasn't here for applause or recognition. Those things had never driven him. His life, both in uniform and out, had taught him a truth that burned quietly within him. Service wasn't confined to battlefields or grand gestures. It lived in the everyday, in the choice to notice a child sitting alone, to offer a hand without expecting thanks, to see people not for their flaws but for the potential they carried. As the flag reached the top of the pole, snapping gently in the breeze, Leo rested a hand on Sam's shoulder. The boy looked up, his wide eyes shimmering with gratitude and something deeper, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. In that fleeting moment, the burdens they both carried, Leo's memories of service, Sam's quiet struggles, seemed to lighten, if only for a breath. The crowd might see a Marine and a boy, but Leo knew the truth. This wasn't about uniforms or titles. It was about connection, about showing up for someone when they needed it most. As the ceremony drew to a close, the courtyard didn't empty as it once might have. Parents lingered, their voices soft as they chatted with teachers, forging bonds that had been absent before. Children darted through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the low hum of conversation as they greeted veterans with shy smiles and eager questions. Principal Simmons, in a moment that would have been unthinkable a year ago, knelt to help a kindergartner tie his shoe, her hands gentle, her smile warm. For Leo, watching from the sidelines, it was a scene that filled him with quiet hope. Willow Creek wasn't just a school anymore. It was a community rediscovering its heart. Later, as a group of students gathered around him on the playground, Leo shared a simple lesson. "You don't need a uniform to serve," he told them, his voice steady but kind. "Sometimes it's just about seeing someone who needs a hand and reaching out." The children listened, their faces earnest, and Leo felt a flicker of certainty that they would carry this truth with them. The transformation at Willow Creek wasn't just local, it sparked something larger, something that reached far beyond the school's gates. A program was born, one dedicated to supporting students from military families, providing school meals, and fostering community service projects across the nation. But for those who called Willow Creek home, the change was most keenly felt in the small human moments. It was in the parent who paused to ask a teacher how they were doing, in the child who shared a snack with a classmate, in the teacher who stayed late to listen to a student's worries. Leo's quiet act, a sandwich and a note, offered without fanfare, had set it all in motion. It had touched Sam's life, then rippled outward, reshaping a school, a town, and even sparking a national conversation about what it means to serve with compassion and honor. In a world that often moves too fast, where people rush through their days without pausing to notice those around them, Leo's example stands as a quiet reminder of something timeless. True service doesn't always come with medals or headlines. It's found in the simple, human acts that connect us. A shared meal, a kind word, a moment of attention for someone who feels unseen. These gestures can create ripples that change lives in ways we can't predict. For the older adults who hear this story, it resonates deeply. Many have been Leos in their own way, offering quiet support to their families, their neighbors, their communities. They know the power of a helping hand extended without expectation. And for the rest of us, Leo's journey is a call to pause, to notice, to act. Because sometimes the smallest gesture can transform not just a moment, but an entire world. In a small, unassuming town where the days often blurred into one another, a quiet act of kindness unfolded, one that would ripple through lives in ways no one could have predicted. The morning was crisp, the kind where the air carried a faint chill and the streets hummed with the familiar rhythm of routine. Among the crowd was Emma, a woman in her late 30s whose life had become a tightrope walk between exhaustion and resilience. She moved through the world with a guarded heart, her shoulders hunched under the weight of unspoken burdens. Her job at the local diner demanded long hours, her smile a practiced mask to hide the worry that gnawed at her. Bills piling up, her daughter's school fees looming, and the constant ache of feeling like she was failing at keeping it all together. Every morning as she tied her apron, Emma whispered to herself a mantra of survival. Just one more day. You can do this. But beneath that resolve, a quiet despair flickered, a fear that she was slipping further into a life she couldn't control. Across town, in a modest corner store that smelled of fresh bread and old wood, stood Henry, a man whose weathered hands told stories of decades spent working to provide for others. At 62, Henry had seen his share of hardship, but his eyes still held a spark of warmth, a stubborn belief in the goodness of people despite the world's tendency to disappoint. He'd owned the store for 30 years, and though his back ached and his savings dwindled, he refused to let go of the place that had become his anchor. To Henry, the store wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary where he could offer a smile, a kind word, or a listening ear to anyone who walked through the door. But lately he felt the weight of his own solitude. His children had moved away, his wife had passed years ago, and the store's quiet moments left him wrestling with thoughts he rarely voiced. Am I still making a difference? Does anyone even notice? On this particular morning, Emma entered Henry's store, her steps heavy with the fatigue of another sleepless night. She needed milk for her daughter's breakfast, but her wallet felt impossibly light, and the shame of counting coins in public clawed at her pride. As she stood in the aisle, her fingers trembling as she calculated what she could afford, her mind spiraled. What kind of mother can't even buy milk, she thought, her chest tightening with the familiar sting of inadequacy. She avoided eye contact with Henry, who stood behind the counter, his gaze soft but perceptive. To Emma, every glance felt like judgment, though in truth, Henry saw something else entirely. A woman carrying a load she didn't deserve, fighting battles he could only imagine. Henry, wiping down the counter with a row that had seen better days, noticed the tension in Emma's posture, the way her hands fidgeted as she lingered near the dairy case. His heart tugged with a quiet empathy. He'd seen that look before, not just in Emma, but in countless others who passed through his store, their faces etched with the silent struggles of life. Henry didn't know the full scope of Emma's story, but he didn't need to. He'd learned long ago that kindness didn't require a complete picture, just a willingness to act. As Emma approached the counter with a single carton of milk, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked for the total, Henry's mind raced. He thought of his own lean years, the times when a stranger's small gesture had been the difference between despair and hope. She needs more than milk today, he thought, his resolve firming like a vow. Instead of ringing up the purchase, Henry slid the milk across the counter and waved a hand dismissively. On the house, he said, his voice steady but warm, like a fire on a cold night. Emma froze, her eyes widening with a mix of disbelief and suspicion. Her pride bristled. She wasn't a charity case, or so she told herself. But beneath that reflex, a wave of relief crashed over her, so intense it nearly brought tears. She wanted to protest, to insist she could pay, but the words caught in her throat. Henry's gaze held no pity, only understanding. And in that moment, Emma felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. He's not judging me, she realized, her heart softening. He's just helping. She managed a quiet thank you, her voice thick with emotion, and left the store clutching the milk like a lifeline. For Henry, the act was small, a drop in the bucket of his day, but it filled him with a quiet satisfaction that lingered. He didn't know that Emma would return home that morning with a lighter heart, that she'd hug her daughter a little tighter, or that she'd replay his kindness in her mind for days, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she felt. He didn't know that his gesture would inspire Emma to pay it forward weeks later, when she slipped an extra tip to a struggling coworker despite her own tight budget, her heart whispering, "Someone help me. I can help too." And Henry, back at his store, continued his quiet routine, unaware that his simple act had sparked a chain of compassion that would touch lives beyond his own. In the days that followed, Emma found herself noticing the people around her more. The tired cashier at the grocery store, the elderly neighbor who rarely spoke but always seemed lonely. Her own struggles hadn't vanished, But Henry's kindness had shifted something inside her, a reminder that even in her hardest moments, there was room to give, to connect. She began to carry herself with a little more hope, a little less fear, as if the weight of the world had been lightened, if only by a fraction. Henry, too, felt a subtle change. The store felt warmer, the days less heavy, as if each small act of kindness he offered was a way of answering his own doubts about his purpose. He didn't need recognition. The quiet moments when someone's face softened with gratitude were enough. Their paths would cross again, as they always did in a town this small, and each time there was a silent understanding between them, a shared knowledge that the world could be harsh, but it could also be kind. Emma and Henry, two ordinary people, became threads in a tapestry of quiet heroism, their lives intertwined by a single moment that reminded them both. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight.